Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself.
Throughout Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa thinks about death. Even when she is enraptured by a life filled with people, lusciously described flowers, and a world that Virginia Woolf describes as, quote, full of sublimity, even in this world, the question of mortality pervades. It exists in the loneliness of watching taxicabs drive away into London's bustling streets, in the mirrored reflection of her aging face and body, in the wistful memories of girlhood summers spent in Burton that pass through Clarissa's mind, and upon hearing of Septimus Warren Smith's suicide, the question of mortality cuts in the middle of her party. As professor of English Maria DiBattista argues in her essay, Virginia Woolf's Memento Mori, these contractive moments in which the rising and falling vertical motions of life accumulate, expand in the novel alongside their horizontal counterparts, anticipation and retrospection. Mrs. Dalloway revolves around the temporal axis formed between these vertical and horizontal narrative lines, which also establish the metaphoric texture that unites Clarissa and Septimus. However, the resulting structure, which is meant to represent Virginia Woolf's fictional conception of lived experience, is shown to hide a hollow center. Given this, as Woolf writes, that, quote, there is an emptiness about the heart of life, we might ask, why does Clarissa choose to live, even after learning that Septimus does not? This video will discuss how Woolf uses mortality to contrast the spiritual character of her literary doppelgangers, first with Septimus and then with Clarissa. Specifically, we'll be looking at scenes of psychological insight, like Septimus's internal monologue before his death, or Clarissa's during her party. We will adopt this existential and humanist approach to help arrange the myriad impressions of everyday life into the humanistic values that guided Woolf's belief in the possibility of a rich interior life developed through modern fiction. To begin with Septimus is to begin with the problem of suicide, and as Clarissa realizes on page 184, the act of suicide can be understood as, quote, an attempt to communicate. One approach to making sense of Septimus's decision is figuring out what was missing from his life. We can think about the loss of his kindred spirit Evans to the carnage of World War I, the diminishing support of his loving but emotionally burnt out wife Rezia, the callous and unempathetic treatment he receives from renowned psychiatrist Sir William Bradshaw. It is not difficult to see why lonely and alienated Septimus feels that, quote, the whole world was clamoring, kill yourself, kill yourself. As literary critic Gillian points out in her book Virginia Woolf, The Common Ground, quote, Septimus haunts an absolute world, bare of locality, the kind of locality that populates Clarissa's vibrant experiences of London, and instead, Septimus, quote, endlessly and nihilistically endures the traumas of reality alone. A totally different perspective could conclude that Septimus's death is simply inevitable, a byproduct of having mental illness inhabiting a highly industrial environment that suppresses emotional vulnerability. Under this interpretation, Septimus does not really choose to die, but is driven to suicide by uncontrollably painful symptoms that were insufficiently addressed and managed by psychiatric medicine. Septimus has numerous behavioral problems that go far above and beyond Dr. Holmes's unmoving funk and span psychosis, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and even schizophrenia. At a fundamental level, what Septimus is trying to communicate is just that he was sick and needs more medical attention than he was receiving. However, neither of these approaches really appreciates Septimus as an individual who actively participates in his life and therefore has important insights about the condition of his lived experiences. Rather than reducing his suicide to an escape from suffering or an unfortunate side effect predetermined by a psychiatric situation, we can use a more humanistic approach that would recognize that Septimus is a person with existentially relevant goals and that his suicide is therefore an act with meaning. This interpretation aligns with Professor of English Daniel Schwarz's reading of Woolf's fiction as a, quote, process of sorting out values and of participating in her, quote, own quest for meaning. As he argues in his book Reading the Modern British and Irish Novel, Death is one of Woolf's essential artistic subjects because it creates the possibility, quote, to wrench meaning by imposing form on the flux of life. A humanistic reading of Septimus, then, would treat his suicide much like a creative act, a terrible and regrettable tragedy, but one that expresses what lies underneath the empty core of Septimus's being. And much of this interpretive work is already laid out effortlessly in Clarissa's internal monologue. Quote, death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. People feeling the impossibility of reaching the center which, mystically, evaded them. Closeness drew apart. Rapture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death. This statement by Clarissa could be read as a declaration of Septimus as a Christ figure, who self-sacrifices in order to awaken the rest of London to its, quote, eternal loneliness. Yet, Clarissa's conception of suicide as a, quote, embrace suggests that Septimus has entered himself into a larger whole, and therefore cements himself into collective memory rather than erasing himself from it. As Professor Avrom Fleischman's work on Mrs. Dalloway contends, Septimus embodies a, quote, radical form of belief in a collective existence that incorporates people, objects, and even sensory phenomena into a systematic network of organic unity. Virginia Woolf writes on page 22, but they beckoned, leaves were alive, leaves being connected by millions of fibers within his own body. Sounds made harmonies with premeditation, all taken together meant the birth of a new religion. However, I disagree with Fleischman's claim that Septimus sees himself as, quote, a sacrificial object, or as a martyr for mankind with his provocative cry on page 149, I'll give it to you. The humanistic approach falls closer to the notion that Septimus and Clarissa, while having collectivist orientations, are intrinsically narcissistic and have a lack of interest in things outside themselves. Therefore, while it is important to read Septimus in relation to his phenomenological experience of existence as collective, it is equally pressing to understand his motives as serving a private existential need. This is an especially crucial move for our later discussion of Clarissa, who also experiences life communally, but whose needs instead energize her to live. So, what exactly does Septimus need then? Woolf makes it clear that he feels linked to the natural world, that the, quote, earth thrilled beneath him, and that he recognizes, quote, beauty was everywhere. What fuels his ennui then is people and society, quote, only human beings. What did they want? Septimus feels remote from an unappreciative London that has forgotten his grueling and self-damaging efforts to defend them in the war. He clings to memories of Evans, fearing the erasure of individual struggle in mock patriotic monumentalism of, quote, absurd statues and public soldier marches. His wife Rezia subconsciously wishes for him to die so that she can move on with her own life. Septimus then becomes an outsider in his own hometown. Thus, Septimus's suicide is not a sacrifice in the name of man, but a realization of his inward desire to impose himself on society and its collective memory, an action that Woolf suggests succeeds because of its effect on raising Clarissa's own spiritual awareness. This artificial but profoundly meaningful relationship between the disconnected Septimus and the socially prominent Clarissa is important because it illustrates the thin line that Woolf believes separates, quote, sanity and madness, civilization and barbarism. Both desperately want to become whole, to live on in the minds of others, and in many ways, Clarissa's party functions just like Septimus's suicide in its efforts to create memory. And while this may seem pathetic, or as Peter Walsh puts it, quote, frail and thin and very far away, Clarissa's plea, quote, remember my party tonight, is one of existential seriousness. After all, what triggers Clarissa's introspection about Septimus's death is eye contact with a, quote, ashen pale, elderly woman who closes the light of her house in preparation for sleep. Clarissa's later statement that, quote, she felt somehow very like him, that is, Septimus, implies that this image depicts her deep fear of growing old in the domestic abyss of her home and being forgotten by her loved ones. Now, a cynical reading of Mrs. Dalloway would interpret this as a scene of despair, one in which Clarissa resigns herself to Sally Seton's analogy on page 192 about the prisoner scratching, quote, on the wall of his cell, and being trapped in her social role as an upper-class woman. Presumably, her impulse to, quote, go back and find Sally and Peter immediately after contemplating death could be interpreted as complicity, a dependence on social comforts, and an inability to engage with issues of mortality. Yet, the sentence before this runs counter to this notion. Quote, he made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. Here, Woolf not only creates a warm and almost convivial connection between Clarissa and Septimus, she also suggests that Clarissa's party and her urge to, quote, assemble are choices that arise not from a desire to bury the horror of death, but a recognition that death is a well of beauty and meaning itself. As previously mentioned, she is worried about people, quote, feeling the impossibility of reaching the center, which implies both that finding meaning in life is in fact possible, and that Clarissa's mission is to help people feel more aware, or at least more comfortable with their mortality. And in contrast to Sally, who in being reduced to Lady Rossiter at the novel's end, and who does in fact succumb to her social role as an upper-class woman, and also in contrast to Peter, who can only wonder at the, quote, terror and excitement of life, Clarissa, on the other hand, dives headfirst into the question of mortality and comes out alive and transformed. Unlike Septimus, who preserves his ego by removing it from the corruptions of daily life, Clarissa reclaims her individualism from the title Mrs. Dalloway by surrounding herself with other unique people. Both Septimus's suicide and Clarissa's party demonstrate initiative, not complicity, in the face of the bleak landscape of the human condition. The party, too, is a creative act, one that assembles people and their identities, much like how an author arranges characters in a story. People gravitate towards Clarissa's life-affirming aura, in some ways to fill the empty centers of their own beings. After all, why would anyone like the prestigious Prime Minister or the child-burdened Sally bother to attend this party if not for some mysterious, almost magical energy around Woolf's protagonist? Scholar Jeremy Hawthorne remarks that this humanistic vision of Clarissa reaching her spiritual potential, moving from a woman who simply bears her husband's name to her own person, is tempered by the fact that, quote, final extraordinarily striking view of Clarissa's full selfhood is achieved through the eyes of another person, Peter Walsh. This observation implies that Clarissa can never realize herself as an individual because she depends on others, like her husband and memories of Sally, to supplement her identity, much like how Septimus sees himself as a burden through Resia's eyes. However, this account ignores Woolf's fluid characterization of Clarissa that show how Clarissa's identity changes depending on the time and situation she finds herself in. Even within Peter's singular gaze at the end, the narrative twice morphs from the future tense, quote, I will come, to the present tense, quote, it is Clarissa, and finally to the past tense, quote, for there she was. The humanistic approach's claim, then, is not that Clarissa actualizes some ultimate fixed identity, but that she is liberated from the indiscriminate totalization of social institutions and temporal continuity that mortality dissolves. The question still remains, though, why does Clarissa choose to live, and what insights does she provide about what she needs to become whole? Like Septimus, Clarissa is assaulted by episodic memories throughout Mrs. Dalloway, albeit ones of a more nostalgic and warm nature. Septimus's response is to make himself a memory, inflicting his death onto the collective unconscious of London. Clarissa's party plays a similar social role, but it creates connection between people who have occupied Clarissa's mind through presence rather than absence. For Clarissa, then, what she needs is not necessarily other people, but for other people to feel cared for. She admits at the novel's beginning, quote, her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct. And as Gillian Beer points out, Clarissa's sense of kinship is not measured by events, class, or gender. This sort of unconditional positive regard for others, which demonstrates that, quote, she wished the whole world well, and which Peter misinterprets as, quote, effusive, insincere, that this regard is Clarissa's ongoing project to make others feel known. On one level, this reveals her own emotional need to care for others, in part to do what she eventually feels Septimus does for her. Furthermore, it fleshes out Clarissa's method, which is that she wants to share her love for, quote, simply life. Indeed, Clarissa feels immensely lonely among the, quote, carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, but she also finds it incredibly exciting to watch London's lively cityscape. Clarissa may shudder at the sight of her aging body, but she also comes to appreciate the simplicity of, quote, straightening the chairs, and the wisdom that comes after, quote, the triumphs of youth. She becomes conflicted over her memories of burden, lamenting the emotional distance between her and Sally, and sometimes regretting her decision to reject Peter. Yet those exact memories also fill her with a nostalgic joy and reverence of, quote, this moment of June. Even with Richard Dalloway, who is hardly the emotional bulwark that Clarissa needs, even he becomes sympathetic under her gaze. Unlike Septimus, Clarissa creates a unified whole from life by recording the memories and pathways, what Gillian describes as the, quote, vignettes of people, and gathering them into an interconnected sheet that one can find solace in. It is this collectivization of identity, represented by the party, that counters the erasure of identity, represented by suicide. At the close of Quentin Bell's biography of Virginia Woolf is the letter she wrote to her husband Leonard Woolf before she drowned herself. In it, she emphasizes the happiness she feels because of their marriage, but also the overwhelming sense of guilt that she is a burden to him. Importantly, Woolf also mentions her indescribable loss from mental illness, the inability to concentrate or to read. And while it may seem insensitive to impose the literary dichotomy of Septimus and Clarissa onto the regrettable situation of an author, after all, we cannot truly know what kept Woolf living until that point, I believe it is crucial that literature be used to understand how people really lived. What is clear from Mrs. Dalloway is that people's lives are incredibly conflicted, and that to survive an ever-changing modern world, we must combat an endless series of choices. And at the most basic level, as Hamlet puts it, we must all answer the question to be or not to be.